I'm Paddy Tillett, President of the City Club. Welcome to another timely City Club forum, this time on the subject of the nature of terrorism. Our special speaker today is Dr. Gary Perlstein, until very recently Chair of the Division of the Administration of Justice at Portland State University, a renowned expert on terrorism. But first, of course, some announcements. Join us next Friday, the 16th, for a forward-looking presentation on the subject of Portland's form of city government. We'll examine the history and the nature of the current system and hear about a proposed ballot initiative to change it. Following a presentation on each, a moderated discussion between the participants will draw out the advantages and disadvantages of the two systems. Our speakers will be Carl Abbott, Professor of Urban Studies from the Portland State University, Robert Ball, petitioner of the proposed Good Government Initiative, and Jim Redden, City Government reporter for the Portland Tribune, who will be the moderator. And that will be here at the MAC. All of you have received a pledge card and a letter asking you to participate generally in this year's annual fund campaign. And thanks to the generosity of our corporate friends and to many of you, we've already raised over 75,000 of our 95,000 target, which is terrific progress. It's better than usual despite the economy, but I would urge you to stick at it until we get to our target. Please write a check today to help us get past that goal, and remember this year your pledge can be deducted from your credit card on a monthly basis, so you'll hardly feel it. Someone pointed out it costs you about a latte a month, so it's not a very expensive thing to do. A reminder that our new and improved website is up and running. You can now join the club, make luncheon reservations and hear Friday programs online. The club's website is at www.pdxcityclub.org. Earlier this month, we instituted a new policy of handing out name tags at the Friday forums. For the benefit of failing memories as well as new acquaintances, do please use them during the program. This is your opportunity to meet and get to know people and for them to get to know you. If you have questions about the club, board and staff members are wearing plastic name tags like this, and so do buttonhole them and ask them your question. Our member host today is Tom Deering, member of the Board of Governors and retired Stowe Reeves attorney. He will ask the first question of our speaker. Following Tom's question, we'll open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. Please line up behind the microphone where we now have chairs arranged so that we have, and be ready with your question before Tom's finished so we have time for as many questions as possible. Please identify yourself as a member of the City Club and ask your question in 30 seconds or run the risk of the dreaded question mark. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Legacy Health Systems, Pope & Talbot Incorporated, and Washington Mutual Savings Bank, and we're most grateful for their support. One of the most disconcerting things about the attacks of September 11th is that no one claimed responsibility for them. For years we've read about terrorist attacks overseas, but usually with the tag of authorship attached, be it Tamil guerrillas, the IRA, Basque separatists, or whomever. We entered a new era 2 months ago with acts of terrorism on our own shores, and of unprecedented scale. Coming to grips with the terror in our own land from a faceless entity has sent dozens of journalists from around the world to the door of PSU's own Dr. Gary Perlstein. Dr. Perlstein came to PSU 30 years ago with degrees in sociology and a doctorate in criminology. He became chair at the Administration of Justice Department in 1980, stepping down this fall to concentrate on finishing his second book, amongst many other things. And interviews with him have been widely published in periodicals such as The Economist. Dr. Perlstein's a member of the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, the American Corrections Association, American Society of Criminology, Society for the Study of Social Problems, and the Western Society of Criminology. Dr. Perlstein also serves on many community boards and has served as a member of one of our City Club research committees. He likes to remind his students that terrorism is nothing too new to us, quoting H. Rap Brown's comment that political violence is as American as apple pie. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the City Club, Dr. Gary Perlstein.
Thank you. very much. Before we start, I should check to make sure there's no bombs or anything else underneath the rostrum. I sort of make a joke about that. We laugh about it, but I should tell you that when I presented a paper the last time in Great Britain, as I entered the hall, they stopped me, checked my attaché case, and ran a metal detector over me. So in places where terrorism has been a problem for many, many years, security, even in the academic setting, has become, unfortunately, commonplace. The acts of terror we saw on September 11th took us by surprise. And perhaps is the biggest question I've asked is why were we taken by surprise? Why did we ever think we were immune from terrorist attack? Osama bin Laden, back in July of this year, had told us he was going to do something bad to us. And one of the main reasons, I believe, is that for many of us Americans, we have tried for many years to deny reality. Even though there is a great deal of evidence, beginning even when we were colonies, that our history is full of examples of disobedience, violence, rebellion, terrorism, dissent, and protest. Most political leaders and most social commentators have created a fictitious world that a noted historian has described as the myth of peaceful progress. The myth said that the United States was the only country in the world where diverse groups had learned to live peacefully and to compromise their differences. Because we had developed the art of peaceful power sharing, there was no need for political, social, or economic conflicts that were so prevalent in other countries of the world. One would think that the riots of the 1960s in our major urban areas, the adventures of the Weathermen, the Simbides, the Liberation Army, the Puerto Rican National Liberation Front, the Ku Klux Klan, and more recently the Order, would have made us aware that violence was present in the political fabric of the United States. We didn't seem to learn it. H. Rap Brown's comment shocked the public. But the staff report to the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence supported his assertion. There has been a vast amount of violence connected with some of the most constructive, positive, and indeed among the noblest chapters in our national history. Which is, for some reason, the violence never got told with it. One Oregon historian has said that our nation was conceived and born in violence. One of the earliest recorded instances of rebellion that I know of, and terrorism, by the way, took place in 1676 when we were still one of the colonies. When a gentleman by the name of Nathaniel Bacon rebelled against the colonial governor. 100 years later, the Revolution. And we have all heard about the nice things of the Revolution, but most of us have never heard about the fact that a group of people called Tories who were really loyal British subjects and not traitors, were being tarred and feathered by other colonials who didn't like their attitude. And so we have actual terrorism taking place as early as the late 1700s in this country. Now after this, the main thrust of violence, we saw what we call religious terrorism. Many of the Protestants did not like another group of people called Catholics. And so Catholics were persecuted in this country. In fact, Thomas Jefferson was asked not to include Catholicism when he was talking about freedom of religion. But Thomas Jefferson had a better mind than many of the people of his time. Catholics were not the only victims of his religious violence. Mormons in Ohio and Missouri were also beaten and murdered. And then we have the thing called the Civil War. And while we hear about the great battles of military forces fighting military forces, as having lived for 17 years in the state of Missouri, I heard a lot about is a gentleman by the name of Quantrell, who burned a city called Lawrence, Kansas, now the home of the University of Kansas. And while he called himself a guerrilla fighter, the people of Kansas would have definitely called him is a terrorist. And in fact, he may be one of our first examples of the old hackneyed expression, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Is this guerrilla warfare that occurred is definitely terrorism, there's no question. But of course, the Civil War brought us some other things. It brought us feuds, lynch mobs, vigilantism, and it also gave birth to a terrorist group, which unfortunately we still have today in parts of our country, called the Ku Klux Klan. And another terrorist group came out about the same time that is now no longer with us, except we now know them as labor unions, because they were called the Molly Maguires. And they were in Pennsylvania and were trying to protect miners' rights. This also created another thing which we're now familiar with called state terrorism, because all the police in those days were bought and paid for completely. I mean, the mine owners actually ran the police forces. And so we are dealing here with maybe our first case of state terrorism taking place. Labor unrest started in the 1919 in a big way and appears to be the cause of the letter bombs that kept being sent to prominent business leaders. Nobody took credit for those either. In Colorado, we have what became known as the 30 Years' War, and that strike climaxed when the miners' tent city was burnt down, and 2 mothers and I believe 16 children were murdered. That led again to an example of state terrorism, which took place in 1919 when an organization that probably none of us have ever heard of, called the General Intelligence Division of the Justice Department, started making warrantless searches and arresting about 600 different people, most of whom, by the way, were let go. I should point out something interesting, which I learned while doing some research for this paper, is that the gentleman who headed his organization was a gentleman known as J. Edgar Hoover. And so if we wonder why he made some mistakes later on, he may have been making them very early. Now an historian, I'm talking about the violence, and violence we normally look at as very bad. Let me quote you another historian who said that the labor movement reveals the same mixture of glorious ends with inglorious means, violence, that has characterized the agrarian reform movement as well. During the 1930s, as we move up in history, and I'll try not to bore you too much longer with history, we have a gentleman by the name of Father Coughlin, who decided to persecute the Jews. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of his partners in what my father told me were some of the billboards around the country at the time, was a gentleman known as Henry Ford, who also signed his name to some of the same pamphlets that Father Coughlin did. Now the 50s and 60s saw more violence and unrest, as we saw groups known as the Weathermen, as we saw groups known, actually one that started in Portland, Oregon, Posse Comitatus, which is no longer really active in Portland, but if you go to the Midwest, especially in North and South Dakota, you will find members of Posse Comitatus still in existence. And we also have, of course, the Right to Life groups. Now I think we have a background that we could discuss the present concerns that we all have. Before we get into some is real concerns. One of the problems I found teaching terrorism for a number of years is nobody knows how to define it. And there's good reason why we don't know how to define it. The last time I checked, there was 150 definitions, and probably in the time we've been here, somebody's added at least 2 more. Is no one definition seems to satisfy is the interpretations of people of what terrorism is. So let's look at what it is. Terrorism is a special type of violence. It is a frightening violence because the threat of it is always with us. And a terrorist attack is likely to occur is when we least expect it. And at a place where we least expect it. Terrorism is a criminal offense under every legal code, both nationally and internationally. And with few exceptions, it is forbidden in war, as well as forbidden, of course, in peacetime. Now, the terrorist believes that their cause is altruistic and serving to better society. Is by distinguishing terrorists from other forms of criminals and terrorism from other forms of crimes, is we can begin to appreciate what it really is. Let me give you 4 things. 1, it is always political in its aims and motives. It doesn't matter whether religion is behind it or ideology is behind it. It is still, they want political power. That is a goal. It always involves actual violence, or it threatens violence. And so even though a group says, well, we're not terrorists because we haven't killed anybody, is the fact they may do things which could lead to the death of somebody accidentally may make them a terrorist group anyway. And it's the reason why some of our local groups have been called terrorists by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and myself because of the threat of violence. Now, one of the keys of terrorism is that it is meant to have a far-reaching psychological repercussion way beyond the immediate victim or target. And so, in other words, what the terrorist does is to win a battle. It's not to win a war. It's to get people watching, listening, and thinking about what the terrorist wants us to learn. And it is conducted by an organization with an identifiable chain of command, or I had to add recently, cell structure, and perpetrated by what's called a subnational group, or a non-state entity. Now, what, of course, I mean by that is that terrorists may be working for another country, but never officially. We do have terrorists who act as mercenaries. And so they may be controlled and ordered by another country, but the other country will always be able to say, oh, we didn't have a thing to do with it, and will never find a tie to them. Terrorism is simply a means to an end. And this needs to be understood so that moral beliefs and sociological, political, and psychological gobbledygook don't confuse our understandings of it. We shouldn't try to make it something that it isn't. It's a means to an end. It's designed to do something. It's probably the best definition that tries to do this has been done by the Department of Defense. I'll take the liberty of reading it to you. It is the calculated use of violence or the threat of violence to inculcate fear, intended to coerce or to intimidate governments or societies in the pursuit of goals that are generally political, religious, and ideological. Now, I like to add one extra sentence. And the sentence was first said by Brian Jenkins, an internationally renowned known expert on terrorism, and I'm happy to say a friend of mine. And he said this about 25 years ago. Terrorism is theater. Therefore, terrorists do not want a lot of people dead. They want a lot of people watching and listening. And I know there's a question on a lot of people's mouths right now is regarding what happened on the 11th, and I'm sure that'll be a question we'll get to. Today we are concerned with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. But when he is defeated, and he will be, the war on terrorism will be far from over. I was watching the president's talk last night, and one of my great concerns with it was the fact that it was sounding like, when we win this, everything will be fine. Well, let's see. In the Mideast, we find an Egyptian group known in the West as Islamic group is IG. They are fundamentalists, and are the group which killed 58 European tourists at the temple in Luxor in 1997. Other groups in the Mideast include Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Hamas. In Europe, we have seen a decline in terrorism. But the ETA I apologize to anybody from Spain. I will not try to pronounce the Basque words for it. So we'll call it the ETA. It still exists in Spain. And Turkey has a group known as the Turkish Revenge Brigade and still has the Kurdish problem to deal with. The Philippines has several terrorist groups within its borders. The Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the New People's Army, the Filipino Soldiers for the Nation are the main ones. Indonesia has the Free Papua Organization. And in Latin America, there are still terrorist groups, especially in Peru and Colombia. And all through Latin America, there are the rumors of state terrorism that continue in the guise of death squads. Now let's take a look at our own country. What I call the homegrown terrorist. During the 1980s, the FBI was fairly successful at being able to neutralize most of the left-wing groups. Also the failure of communism and the fall of the Soviet Union left many of the groups without an ideology to work with. And so membership in groups on the left have basically declined completely in modern days. The only left-wing group that still really exists is the Puerto Rican terrorist groups, and most of us never hear about them because they're no longer attacking Congress with machine guns, and which, as some of you may remember, they did in the 1950s. On the right, though, there are threats. The militias received a great deal of attention after Oklahoma City. Today, they seem quiet. In fact, I recently had a TV crew thinking about doing a movie, talking about how the right-wing terrorists is gone. And they came and interviewed me, and after their producer heard me speak, he said, "We're not doing the movie." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, they're not gone." I said, "No, they've just gotten smarter than a lot of other people, and they're now keeping their mouth shut because they learned that civil suits can beat them harder than a criminal suit can. And so they've learned to keep themselves down, and especially right now. Now what makes right-wing groups dangerous in the future? Well, gun control issues are one. United Nations involvement in international affairs is another. And law enforcement's way of dealing with some dissidents are cornerstones of their ideology. And of course, what we must realize and always realize, Ruby Ridge and Waco to them are examples of state terrorism. And I should add, after seeing things about Waco, I'm not positive they're totally wrong. But one of the things, when you're dealing with groups that we need to learn better, and I'll mention this, is we need never to make somebody who I would hate to see a hero, make him a martyr. because, you know, it's really a shame that Randy Weaver has folk songs written about him. And this is some of the things that we need to watch out for in our dealings with terrorists. Is, you know, I should mention, I learned sitting at a table with an Annapolis graduate, is one time we were talking about Algeria. And we were talking about how the French Foreign Legion was 100% successful at getting rid of all terrorists is from the province, as France looked at it, is of Algeria. And then he looked at me and he said, yes, and what happened? I said, well, a news cameraman got pictures of how the Legion was able to accomplish this. And world opinion had Charles de Gaulle give Algeria to the Algerians. So the rough methods that at times we like to talk about in our private conversations may not be the best methods at times. So we must always be careful of that when we're dealing with terrorists. It's now the most serious threat in terrorism that I see in this country is from what I call single-issue terrorists. And these groups include the Army of God, who we have just recently found in Clackamas County. The Sheriff's Department made a drug raid and found themselves facing automatic weapons and a lot of literature that were not drug-related, they were terrorist-related. Is that I'll use their own words to explain them to you. Is the day the government of these presently United States of America declared war on God's children through legalizing abortion, is on that day it became simply a matter of time before the army of God would rise up to defend God's children. Is their defense means abortion clinic bombings and the shootings of abortion is doctors. Is do not expect this war to end is until legalized abortion is repealed. And I'm taking it straight from their pamphlet. Now we also have another group, which some of you probably, my guess, feel more akin to, is radical environmentalists. And they, unfortunately, are a source of terrorism. Now most environmentalists protest against the term is applied to some of their members. And I will say that their complaints are as just as any religion or ideology is that cannot be held responsible for the actions of the extremists within their ranks. Is the borderline between environmentalism and terrorism is crossed is once it is believed that the salvation of the planet depends on the destruction of civilization. But if society is the exterminators, then it is moral to kill the exterminators. In parts of Europe, this has already begun. Is firebombs and death threats there have become the norm. We have already had a gentleman by the name of Ted Kaczynski. And is it unreasonable to believe that there will be an individual or group who believes that mankind is beyond redemption and does not deserve to survive? Well, I am near the end of my presentation. After Al-Qaeda, we will still be menaced by other terrorist groups. As the military and law enforcement agencies have learned, and unfortunately they've learned it the hard way in many cases, is combating terrorism requires a continuous state of awareness. Is the threat of terrorism is always present, is that, again, I'll repeat myself, and an attack is likely to occur when least expected. Today there are added dangers. Nuclear, biological, and chemical terrorism are real dangers. Our modern technology has also created the danger of cyber terrorism. Are there terrorists who would use such weapons? Yes, there are. The sword of Damocles is hanging over our heads. is what can we do? Not much. Is be a little bit more vigilant and believe our government will do its best. But we have joined the other countries of the world, and we now know there is no such a thing as 100% security. Is perhaps the old saying of the Revolutionary War is as accurate today as it was in 1776. Is put your faith in God, but keep your powder dry. And I thank you very much. I'm ready, Tom.
Okay. I'm sure there will be other questions.
Oh, I'm sure.
For a moment. Thank you very much. Not for making us all feel a lot better. You essentially have described the pervasiveness of terrorism and a whole variety of different kinds of terrorism. The terrorism we've most recently experienced is very international, and there are many people who feel that the kind of posture that we have assumed in our dealings with other parts of the world that are otherwise far removed from us has contributed significantly to bringing onto our shores people who would otherwise be strangers to our society and not interested in our society, and their terrorist battles wouldn't be fought here. Does that seem to you to be a reasonable evaluation of some aspects of what's going on right now? And if it is, then is there something that we should be doing in the way in which we cast our shadow across the rest of the world?
It's a very interesting question, and I feel good. I have to tell one of my students, I just want to thank her for asking almost the same question to me yesterday. And so I'm a little bit prepared. At least I have an answer. I'm not sure if it's a good answer. I was asked this, like I said, a similar question by a student, and I looked at the student, and I said, do you believe that a woman should be held responsible for being raped because she is wearing a short skirt? And of course, the student looked at me horrified, said, of course not. I said, well, we shouldn't be blaming the victim. We have done, let me be the first to say, we have done many things, is that as we look back in time, gee, I wish I hadn't done that. And hopefully we can learn from some of those things and make sure we don't do those things in the future. And maybe we decide we do want to do them in the future. I don't like somebody trying to dictate my life for me. The government does it to an extent, and my loved ones do it to an extent, but I don't like other people in other countries sort of telling me what to do at all times. And I think what we need to do in reality, and again, I'm going to say something, is I have not seen the proof that bin Laden did the present attack. I will assume it's there because there's enough other countries who are not always our friends who agreed that he did it, and so I believe that he did. And I'll be very honest with you all, I was woken up on the 11th by KXL radio at 6:10 in the morning, and I thought they were joking, and they said, get out of bed and go turn on your TV. And so I did. I turned on the TV. I saw the devastation, and without thinking, because I try to be more careful when I say things, I said, is bin Laden. And the reporter said, how can you say that? And I said, because he is the best organized, best coordinated, has the best terrorist group in the world today. And I said, that's what something like that took. So, I'm pretty sure, but, I'll be the first to say I could be definitely wrong. But yes, as people don't like what we do in the world. And people sometimes my neighbors, I'm sure, don't like what I do around my house. I'm not sure if that gives them the right to attack is in a terrorist manner. It's sort of like, why do we have terrorism as we know it today? I should mention something to you. The old-fashioned terrorists killed nobility. They killed police chiefs. They killed government officials. And they were happy doing it. And as somebody said, after World War II, they seemed to modify slowly but quickly. And they started killing what we call non-combatants or innocents. And somebody said, well, why did it change? I said, well, actually, the fault is us. And I said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, years ago, when you killed the head of a country, is everybody in the country turned around and listened. Is everybody cared. Is unfortunately, when you do something like that in many of our countries today, not only ours, but other countries in the Western world, we say, gee, that's terrible, and turn on the blazer game. And, you know, as we were horrified on the 11th, and we're still doing, you know, charity presentations and gifts, you know, to the victims' families. But actually, I haven't seen a thing about the action. I think most people, it sort of passed them by already. And in fact, somebody like me reminds them of it. They say, oh, I don't want to talk to Gary. Because, you know, we almost don't want to pay attention to sometimes what the terrorist is trying to tell us. And the terrorist is, you know, may have wanted to do it in a small way, but is not able to because of us.
Thank you. Carol Witherell, member of City Club. Ellen Goodman wrote recently that neither the good versus evil hard dichotomy explanations nor the blowback explanations that say that September 11th is the result of U.S. foreign policy practices in the past are really sufficiently complex or accurate ways to respond to the terrible events of September 11th. So as a fellow educator, my question is, what can we learn from those terrible events? And how do we keep civic discourse wide open and complex during the current wave of impassioned patriotism? And what role can education and organizations like City Club play long-term in keeping civic discourse wide open in ways that would guide and frame our strategic responses at home and abroad?
It's one of the things that, you know, I was recently called by part of our university administration and asked if I would think about giving a talk to faculty and administrators about something. And I said, oh, what? And they said, well, some faculty are having problems because students are disagreeing with them in class. And I guess in some cases, it has almost come to blows. I don't know if it actually has come to blows. And I said, really? And the reason I said really is since everybody here is civic-minded and knows politicians, as I was saying earlier at the table here, is I am very, very proud to have had as products of my department and my classes is probably the Portland area's most liberal state senator and probably its most conservative state senator, Zavelle Gordley and John Minnis. And I am also very happy to say that I'm friends with both. And in fact, Zavelle has told me recently that her and John during the session have breakfast together many times. I think one of the things we need to do is make sure that all sides get to speak. Is that there is a place, as John in fact said to one of our presidents at the university once, I really liked Professor Perlstein because he let me say the things as I did. And I remember saying to the president when she told me that, I said, yeah, I disagreed with almost everything he said. But I felt he was entitled to have a place to express himself. This is one thing we need to do, forums like this. As I would be happy if somebody says, Perlstein, you're full of it. I'd say, good, let's discuss it. We have military in the audience. We have liberals in the audience. We have everybody in the audience. This is a great place where people... Now, the thing is, I'm not sure because I'm not here that often. Does everybody feel comfortable to say what they think? And that's the other thing. They need to have the atmosphere. It's like my students have learned, you may disagree with me, but you will never get a lower grade. Now, they didn't believe me. They have to speak to other students. And that's something I think is the way we can do something, is just make sure that everybody can speak.
Ray Polanyi, a City Club member. You said that terrorism is an old thing. Mm-hmm. In recent times, asked Niccolò Machiavelli, the ends justify the means. What is new, and you also touch on that, is the enormity of the technological impacts that are being used. My question is, how about a change of our ways? How about submitting to international laws? How about submitting to international judgment? It seems to me the time is right and ripe for that.
It's a good point, and as I wouldn't disagree with it at all. As long as we can be sure that the international court is going to be fair. For instance, as I have talked to people that have been in our Balkan areas in recent years, and all of them have told me that the gentleman who is going to be tried in the very near future is a war criminal, in his opinion. I said, oh, okay. And then they have added, but how come the person running the other country who did just as bad things to the Serbs is not being tried also? And that's part of the problem when we deal with the international situation. Like, it's only been recently is that the UN is actually recognizing terrorism. It's because too many countries that belong to the UN got their start with terrorism, including one that I know you've all heard of. In fact, it's part of the foreign policy question. It's called Israel. There's a gentleman by the name of Menachem Begin who blew up the King David Hotel. And of course, his excuse was he warned the British ahead of time, but they wouldn't believe him. Sadat of Egypt was a terrorist, to the British at least. And so, as soon as the international court is totally fair, it's a good idea.
Nikki Lynch, member. You mentioned making martyrs out of people of this ilk. And isn't there a risk as we continue to bomb Afghanistan that we at least make martyrs of the Taliban, not to mention?
Let me sort of preface my comment back first. I differ on strategy with the president, but let me also add, the president has not called me and I have not called him. So it's just fair disagreement. I have always questioned bombing empty training camps. I question that. I firmly believe in using special operations people and doing it what I consider the proper way. But I don't think we have a risk of making the Taliban martyrs except in the United States. The people of Afghanistan, from everything I can tell, don't like the Taliban. But the people of many countries where they have dictators running things don't have much say about getting rid of them. And so I'm not sure, no matter what happens to them, that the people of Afghanistan, in most cases, wouldn't be cheering. Now, the trouble is that in the United States, we get a lot of one-sided information. And it's one of the reasons I say, you know, I like debate things because at least you get two sides, and there's usually 4 or 5 sides, but two is better than one. Is I'm more concerned that when you take a person who takes a shotgun and saws it down 1/16 of an inch too short, and is the government, instead of waiting till he comes out of his home and arresting him in town, sends a team of ATF and then FBI in on a military maneuver to attack him, kills his golden retriever first, which we all know how bad an attack dog golden retrievers are. In fact, we all should know because he was a special agent in charge here for a number of years, Danny Colson. And Danny was called in after it happened, and after he heard what breed of dog was shot by the FBI with his own people, he actually called for an autopsy of the dog and found that the dog was shot in the rear. And when all this was over, Danny himself, who was a very loyal FBI agent at the time, said, yep, 1/16 of an inch, and let's see, Weaver's wife is now dead, Weaver's son is now dead, his dog's now dead, and I think they've killed 3 agents. Was this worth it? And of course, because a lot of people felt it wasn't, is that a lot of these are right-wing people who are scared, the black helicopters, and that, any firearms law means they're going to take mine away. This person became a hero. And being Jewish, as I am, and being that he still happens to be a neo-Nazi, I sort of frown on this man becoming a hero to anybody. But it's actually our actions of our government that caused it. And so that's what I mean. It really has to be a clear case, and I think the Taliban are not heroes to very many people in Afghanistan. It's at least from my information.
John Leeper, City Club member. Sir, this is a variation on a theme that has been asked before. However, I'll ask it anyway.
Go ahead.
There seems to be, in the at least Arab world, considerable turmoil and misunderstanding of our perspective on the sequence of events on the 11th of September, as well as sympathy for Afghanistan and bin Laden. You have spoken about things within the U.S. on an international scene. What do you see that we could do to quite possibly improve the psychological climate for something other than a considerable amount of what we hear related as either dis or misinformation?
Well, it's difficult to say because, one, I have spoken to several of my old students one is a Saudi general, and we are still good friends, and he lived in the United States for a number of years, so he understands us, perhaps sometimes I think better than we do. And I don't see the same type of reaction I'm seeing on the media. And sometimes I wonder if the media, when they show us, the people laughing and happy when the towers fell, is whether they didn't walk around until they found some children who were happy about it, but it doesn't mean the majority of them are happy about it. I'm not sure that we get the thing, the same way they don't understand us, is we at times don't understand them. The best way is how do we get real knowledge about the United States people to them? And it's difficult to do because we are considered an evil. It's even when we're doing good. When we provide aid to Egypt so they can feed some of their starving people, and unfortunately, as I understand it, some of their government members are not exactly the most honest in the world. And so some of the money that we give for aid ends up in Liechtenstein or Luxembourg. The people don't get it. And so when the radical fundamentalist comes by and says, join with us and we'll give you what you deserve, and it's just the United States who is playing games with your government, those people say, sure, why not? They're ignorant. They're uneducated. If we could find a way, there was a cartoon going around, which is I think maybe appropriate to mention. It was a letter sent to the Taliban leaders, is to scare them. And the letter was that if you don't turn over bin Laden, we are going to educate your women. And, that was laughable and everything else, but if we would actually start doing something like that, giving scholarships, if we could get them here even with the scholarship, I think we'd accomplish an awful lot. Go ahead.
Kurt Webring, member. The framework of the response of our government to 9/11 seems to be retribution and some sense trying to make it certain to those who would threaten the country that they will be apprehended and brought to justice. What evidence is there in the historical record that you look at that this framework is an appropriate one?
Well, is one, the framework that you mentioned, I can do it. What our government's doing, I'm not positive. And like I joked, but I was very serious. The president does not call me and I don't call him to discuss it. So as I disagree with strategies that are used, is for everything Israel has learned, and Israel is one of our best examples of how to deal with terrorism, is a strong response. It will not end terrorism. There's no 100% security. Any politician tells you that, vote against them. Is the only thing is you can do is make things so bad is that they will have to think twice. It's one of the things people have said, is Portland really a terrorist target? And my answer is, most circumstances, I would say no. And the reason is because, like I said earlier, terrorists want a symbol. And, we don't have the Golden Gate Bridge. We don't have the Space Needle. We don't have, any of the things that the world would recognize. But I said, if the security becomes so good in those places, is that imagine the scenario, and I hope nobody here is going to take and go out and do this, but I said, imagine the scenario of them hitting 4 medium-sized cities at the same time. That would be a symbol, and that would get everybody's attention. And so Portland could become a target that way.
Corleen Kraft, member. There seems to be a body of opinion developing that it's fairly likely that the anthrax came from a homegrown terrorist. FBI profilers, I noticed yesterday, a lot of the biochemists. What do you think about this? And if, in fact, you believe that it's the case, who do you think that opportunistic homegrown terrorist might be?
Good question, and it's interesting. I worry about FBI profilers. So it's one of our classes we've had at our university for a couple of years now, is a good one on criminal profiling. And one of the criticisms always made in that class is of the FBI profile system. So, but let's forget that for a second. If it is, yes, the first people who got hit was the National Enquirer. And even though it's called American media, yes, I can tell you when they call you up to do an interview, they say, hi, I'm so-and-so from the American media. And then very quietly they say, the Enquirer. So I was thinking, and I was talking to a reporter actually during this thing when they were the first targets. And we were talking about it being possibly homegrown. In fact, I was believing it was completely homegrown. Then, as things started getting wider with it, I started thinking that it might be international. As though I did know that, and one of the things I think they're going on in their profile is there is a chemical in some of the anthrax that, at least that we know of, is that definitely shows it was made in the good old USA. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a homegrown terrorist using it. It could have been stolen. It could have been sold. If it is homegrown, is who might use it? I'm going to say something that's probably going to surprise a lot of people, because it would have to be a group that is actually looking at scaring people. Let me comment, and I know you had a speaker a few weeks ago, I believe, on is chemical terrorism and biological terrorism. But anthrax is a lousy bug to use to kill people. It's a great one to use to scare people. It's a great one to get your attention. But it's not going to kill a lot of people, and there's cures for it. I won't go into. There are a few I could name, but I don't want running around. But we had a group in the 60s that tried to steal his material from Fort Detrick in Maryland. They failed at it, so they never got to use it. That was the Weathermen. If we want to look, what group today do we have that matches some of the profile characteristics of the Weathermen? And the only ones we have are some of the radical environmentalists. But we have had cases of chemical terrorism that we've been lucky enough to stop ahead of time by some of the extreme right wing. And so it is possible that it could be them. In other words, it's very difficult to say, because we have enough groups around who dislike us and who dislike our government the way it's doing things, that it could be one of many.
Natalia Anchor-Lagos with the Constitution team at Lincoln High, City Club member. You were talking about keeping vigil. In response, the Senate and the House passed the anti-terrorism bill.
Yes.
How effective do you think this will be in preventing terrorism in the United States?
Well, preventing terrorism, I'm not sure about it. Will prevent a lot of crime. I am not a great favor of the terrorism bill. In fact, I think within 3 days of the 11th, I was on as OPB with the University of Washington law professor. It's about what was going to happen. He already predicted all the things. Some of the things were needed. Most of it was not needed. Most of it is already there. Most of our law enforcement agencies were being a little bit too politically correct, I believe, in the past. And we're afraid of lawsuits, we're afraid of complaints, and so didn't do some of the investigations they should have done. And I'm a little bit afraid that they might have passed laws that could be misused. I would like to believe they won't be. But the history of the United States and our history of law enforcement shows us that they have been misused in the past. As I can mention the old-fashioned one, of course, Dr. King and J. Edgar Hoover, but there's been many others. This is some of the problems we have. So, I wish we had better oversight of our law enforcement agencies, especially on the federal level. We do have it on the local level. We don't have it on the federal level. And so we do have things to worry about. The latest one, I don't know if you've all heard about, is attorney-client privilege may not be there anymore. Or at least it won't be there until the first law test of it, I'm sure, or court test of it. But it's part of the problems we're dealing with today. Yes, sir.
Lloyd Marbett.